That's enough with numbers for now. Let's take a look at more of our data types, continuing with strings. Strings in PHP are a very common data type. We use them a lot. Technically, it's what we use all the time for reading. It's any collection of characters is considered a string. So on line 4, name equals Hampton is a string. It's a string variable. Orlando, Florida, in quotes, is a string. If I was to put it in single quotes, it would also be a string. So all of these are considered strings. But what we want to do is go a little further into strings and kind of understand how we can manipulate strings a little bit, as well as look at a couple of escape sequences that we'll use often with strings. So let's go ahead and do that by coming down to our little work area here. I'm going to remove what we had here before. I'm actually going to bring this PHP tag up. Doesn't really have to be there, but just for cleanliness. Okay. Now in here, we're going to create a new string variable, and we're going to call this greeting. So greeting, and we'll set that equal to a string of hello, comma, friends. Exclamation point, close it with our double quote, and close our statement. Then I'm going to go down here, and I'm actually going to get rid of all this good stuff. And I'm going to echo our greeting. Okay, nothing new here, nothing yet. So let's switch over to our preview and take a look. Hello, friends. Perfect. Now, let's say we want to modify only one character or recall only one character inside of that string variable. Let's say I just want to pull out the H. Well, in PHP, most things are considered zero base indexed. What that is H would be 0 as its index. Then E would be 1. So in order to access this, we would say greeting and then use curly braces. And then simply type in the number of the character that we want. So if we want the first character, 0 based index, we hit 0. Let's save this and look at it in our preview. Just the letter H. If I was to change this to say the number 1, save it and switch over, we should get the E. Great. Okay, so what about if we want to modify this? Well, we've done this a ton. We've simply just modified strings by overwriting them. So there's no reason we couldn't do that now. So I'll just type in greeting here again. And then I'll grab just the first character, which is 0. And then I'll set that equal to something different. So I'll say J. Now, instead of H, it'll be J, which should give us a very interesting result. Refresh. Jello friends. I like Jello friends. All right, so now we know how to grab a character and modify it, or just pull a single character out of a string. That's pretty cool. Now, what about if we wanted to use another greeting, say a secondary greeting? Secondary greeting. And we'll set it equal to another string. So, how are you today? Question mark and semicolon to close our statement. Now, I want to echo the greeting and I want to echo the secondary greeting. All right, let's save that, go to our preview, and refresh. So they're on the same line. Well, what we want to do in HTML, we would just put a break tag, so a BR. But what if we wanted to make a secondary greeting show up underneath inside the string itself? We would use an escape sequence for a new line. Now I'm going to give you a link to these docs in the notes, but for now, this is the escape sequence for a new line. We'll go down and add to the end of our first greeting here a backslash and then in, which means new line. Save that, switch over, and refresh, and now you'll see it's on a new line. So that's one of the cool escape sequences that we can use with strings. This should give you a very base understanding on how to modify and use strings, which we're going to be doing more and more with as we get into internal string functions, as we get into conditionals and comparisons with operators. But that's later on. I just want you to understand that anything that is a collection of characters, such as hello friends or just the letter J, is considered a string. And if you assign that to a variable, it's considered a string variable. The next thing we're going to talk about here is Booleans. So in order to use Booleans, which are just true or false, that means we want no gray area. So let's see, how do we define a variable that would be considered a Boolean variable? So we'll go down to our play area and go down a few lines and add in something new. So we'll create a variable called bool, which is just short for Boolean. And we're going to set that equal to a keyword, true, all caps, which will make this a true Boolean. Now, if we want to redefine this as false, we would simply do it over again right afterwards and say false. Now, order of operation tells us here that this Boolean will be true, and then if we redefine it on line 53, it will be false. But how do we know we're doing that? Well, let's use the var dump, var_dump, which is going to dump variable information, and we're going to say bool. Okay. And then that is going to print it to our screen in a var dump format. So I'll put the docs to the var dump. It's something we're going to use very often, and that's going to be in the notes. So let's save this, switch back over, and refresh. Okay, so it actually says bool true. We're a little bit messy here with the lines, so let's go ahead and comment a couple of these out. Let's refresh that again. Okay, Boolean true. Now, if we did this again on the line after we've modified it, line 55, save that, switch over and refresh. Now you'll say it's Boolean false. So we can modify a single variable by simply using the keyword true or false. We'll use these Booleans more often, true and false, when we start testing things using conditionals, such as if statements and if-else statements, which we'll get into later in the course. But for now, how do you define something that is a Boolean true or a Boolean false? You simply use the keyword true or the keyword false. One thing to keep in mind with Booleans is that anything that is a non-zero value is going to be considered true. So anything that would be considered false would be the Boolean false itself, so the keyword that we've just used, zero values, and then empty strings. So how would we know that? How can we look at some examples of that? Well, I'm going to use var dump, and I'm going to use something called typecasting, which we're not going to get into just yet, but we're going to typecast different types of strings, integers, and see whether something reports as true or false as a Boolean. So these are just for you for examples of what can be considered true and what can be considered false. So I'll do that by starting with a var dump. And then in that var dump, I'm going to use typecasting, which I do that by opening up another set of parentheses and closing them and typing the keyword bool, which is going to say whatever comes after this, I want to typecast as a Boolean. So it's just going to print it out whether it's true or whether it would be false if we were testing it as a Boolean. So if I was to test, say, an empty string, I'm going to save that. I'm going to comment these two out just for clarity here. Same here. Save it, switch over, and refresh. You'll see that an empty string shows as false. So this here is false. Now, let's do another couple of these and see what they look like. So let's test the number 0. Let's test the floating point 0.0, and then we'll test an empty array. Now we're going to get into arrays here soon, but just know that this is an empty array. There's our floating point 0, an empty string, and a 0 integer. So let's save these and see what they all report back as. They all report back as false. So we know that anything that's empty in any way is considered false. Now, if I was to say A, B, C, or change this to 1, or change this to 1.0, and we'll just remove this and we'll actually do a -1. So that would be -1. We'll go back and refresh these. And all of those would be considered true. So none of these are empty. It's not an empty string. This is a 1, this is a 1.0, and a -1. All are definitely non-zero, so those would be considered true. All right, so that should give you a really good understanding of true or false statements using the keyword true or false for a Boolean, and also that anything that is a non-zero will be considered true.